All right, hello all, and welcome to the second talk of our 2023-2024 OCHS Virtual Winter Speaker Series. My name is Ben Falter. I'm the Director of Education at the Ontario County Historical Society in Canandaigua. And before I turn things over to our wonderful presenter, just a couple of quick announcements. First, this speaker series highlights topics related to recreation to tie into our current exhibit at the Historical Society, Let's Go Have Fun. So if you have not already visited the exhibit, it's all about recreation in Ontario County from 1900 to 1965. It's a really cool exhibit. Make sure you come check it out before the end of April, when it will be coming down to make way for our next annual exhibit. And also, again, this is part of a broader speaker series. So if you haven't already looked into the next two speakers in the series, I would highly advise you do so. Check them out. They should be really good talks as well. And of course, thank you for tuning in this evening, for joining us. If you have any questions or comments during the talk, you can type them into the YouTube chat at any point, and I will make sure to pass them off to our speaker at the end for a little bit of Q&A time. And also, if you want to rewatch this talk afterwards, you can rewatch it using the same link that you are using to watch it tonight. But without further ado, allow me to briefly introduce our speaker tonight. Returning for the second year in a row, we have Brandon Brooks. Brandon is the curator of the John L. Wehle Gallery at the Genesee Country Village and Museum. The Genesee Country Village and Museum is New York's largest living history museum, and it's the third largest in the United States, I believe. They preserve the architecture of the Genesee Valley region and presents context for telling New York State and 19th century American history. The John L. Wehle Gallery is part of GCVM, established by the museum's founder and namesake of the gallery. And the gallery highlights art, sporting, wildlife, clothing, and more spanning the 17th to 20th centuries, and is also home to the Susan Greene costume collection, featuring historic clothing from upstate New York with 3,500 plus clothing items across 3 centuries. So quite the resume, and I will go ahead and hand things over to Brandon. So go ahead and take it away.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Ben, for that warm welcome. My name again is Brandon Brooks. I'm the curator here at Genesee Country Village and Museum at the John L. Wehle Gallery. Great introduction. Yep, we have an amazing collection of sporting and wildlife art, material culture from the 19th century, and the Bruce and Susan Greene costume collection, which spans our earliest piece of lace is from the 17th century, but really the the heart of our collection spans, I'd say, like 1790s to right before World War One. I'd also like to announce that we are finally making the conversion to a new cataloging system. So we anticipate by this summer, 2024, our collections will be available online for the general public to study and peruse. I also like to put it out there that if you have any questions, when that time comes, you want better images of the objects, please send us emails. We are an accessible bunch here at Genesee Country Village and Museum. So we love to supply the public with more information, more pictures, and sometimes even reverse engineered patterns from our collection. So today we are going to be talking about the bicycle craze in Rochester, New York, and really cover how Rochester, New York was at the epicenter, or really made themselves the epicenter of the bicycle craze, at least in the United States of America. So some of the topics we're going to explore today, really bicycles and like two-wheeled conveyances are macrocosm. So it would be impossible to get it all into 45 minutes to an hour. So we're going to move at a steady pace, no pun intended, today in this presentation. We're going to look at a little bit of the history of leg-powered vehicles, the iterations of different two-wheeled leg and then pedal driven vehicles across the 19th century that take us to really what now what we call like a regular bicycle, they would know as a safety bicycle in the 1880s. And we'll get into why they call that the safety bicycle versus just a plain bicycle. Once we get to the 1890s, that is when bicycle mania properly hits Rochester and really the rest of the world. We'll see through trial and error with these other vehicles that once they get that formula right with the safety bicycle, everyone wants to ride the bicycle. And Rochester really answers that call and establishes hundreds of miles of side paths, what we would call like bike paths today. Then we get into some female trouble because women are part of everyone in the world. And when everyone wants to ride a bike, women are part of that group of people. And people have very strong opinions about women participating in bicycle riding and bicycling, as well as what they are wearing, the adaptive fashions that women don in order to enjoy this sport, this recreation, and the how some of these fashions are deemed very controversial. Some of the very same language they use in the 1890s to sort of express the anxieties that many people are having about women wearing so-called masculine clothing at this time were you'll see that same language today on certain news networks to talk about perceived gender variance in fashion. So, in many ways, the more things change, the more things stay the same. So we're going to begin in the early 19th century with Carl van Drais, who is a German inventor. And in 1816, he is developing this two-wheeled conveyance. And by the following year, in 1817, he invents what he calls the Luftmaschine or the walking machine. And other people start calling this a velocipede or a swift walker or a draisine or even a dandy horse. There are different groups of people who seem, as we'll see, they seem to sort of take take particular interest in different iterations of two-wheeled conveyances or drazen or draisines as they call them, and they tend to sort of associate that vehicle, that iteration of the vehicle, with that group of people. So at this time, dandies in London are particularly fond of the walking machine, the velocipede, and a nickname, the dandy horse, gets stuck with it. Now, if anyone is wondering, like, well, what is a dandy? A dandy, generally speaking, is a gentleman who takes particular interest in their physical appearance, particularly with fashion and fashion trends. So if the Stanley Cup was a fashion trend, we might be calling these people Stanleys today instead of by their names, Stanley Cup users. So with the same voracious interest that we have for Stanley Cups today, people had probably even more so for the walking machine or the velocipede in the early 19th century. Now, if we look at this example of a velocipede from the Smithsonian, you can see there are no pedals. There is no chain. It is completely powered by one's legs. So you sit on this device and you kind of push it with your legs, and there's a little bit of steering power in the handles. So it's strenuous to use. It can be rather cumbersome. And you might think, well, couldn't I just walk? And on a flat surface, uh, you could walk or use this, but going downhill, you could really pick up speed on one of these velocipedes. And it's particularly well suited to dry, firm pathways. Again, this is before paved flat roads. So in most cities, so you're not going to be able to use it very easily on grass. I guess you could sort of push yourself through the grass, but the friction of the grass and the wheels is going to slow you down almost instantly. So you're going to need a dry, firm, flat surface to really sort of coast as you're pushing yourself on your leg with the velocipede but on beneath our seat, so to speak. So you could go even on a flat surface, you could get anywhere from like 8 to 9 miles per hour on a velocipede, which is faster than running, usually unless you're an Olympic runner. Now going downhill again, you could go very quick, to the point where on a descent, it could equal the power of a horse at full speed. So this walking machine, it's invented and patented in Germany, and then quickly moves over across the channel to England, and then it comes to America in May of 1819. Specifically, it comes to New York City, and at first, only 100 of these velocipedes are released into the city. So if you had the means and the connections to scoop up one of these velocipedes, which they went really quick, and you were a proud owner of a velocipede, you could ride it or drive it anywhere you wanted to, essentially in the city. If you were sort of an everyday person, you didn't have the means or the connections, and you weren't lucky enough to have snatched up one of these 100, the ones that didn't sell, you could rent them. And you could rent them for 50 cents, but you were confined to like this rink. So it's not like a Lime bike that they have today. I believe that's what they're called, where you could rent it and like take it anywhere you want it. You would have to pay the 50 cents and stay within that rink. So that was kind of a damper on the fun people could have. Now, this is the first time a two-wheeled conveyance is sort of entering into all of the other vehicles, in this case, like horse-drawn vehicles throughout New York City. So these, if although you're not going very quickly, you can still move more quickly on a velocipede than like a couple horses pulling a carriage within like a city speed. Um, so these velocipede riders, the people that own the velocipedes and aren't confined to that rink, they're weaving in between the carriages, up and through the roads, and it's causing um, a lot of confusion, probably some anxiety with, oh my goodness, this person is darting in and out, and they're spooking my horses. So people very quickly get very annoyed with velocipede drivers, and this sort of the apprehension for sharing the road begins in the summer of 1819. And by September, so just 3.5, 4 months later, they are banned in New York City, and the New York City Common Council, excuse me, passes the law to prevent the use of velocipedes in public places and on sidewalks in New York City. So if you were to violate this ordinance, you would be fined $5, which in last year's money was $120. In 2024, it's $125. So not breaking the bank, but certainly like a nuisance of a fee. So suddenly, after this summer, there are all these velocipedes that are just like not being used anymore, and they go to waste. And in America, we sort of lose the velocipede loses its appeal. It seems impractical, and sort of seeing them I imagine sort of lying there, not being used, visually and mentally adds to um, their seeming impracticality at this time. Now, something I failed to mention is these people that were darting in and out were called scorchers. And there are all sorts of names for bicyclists throughout the 19th century and into the 20th and 21st that we have for bicyclists that seem to not follow the rules that other people are following. Now, although in America the velocipede seems obsolete and it loses favor for us after 1819, England and France and parts of Germany, they're still very interested in a two-wheeled vehicle, and they want to figure out sort of like the winning formula to make this work. So there are many inventors, many individuals that are sort of throwing their hat in the bicycle ring, and we won't be able to cover all of them. But some of the bigger names are there's a gentleman, a Frenchman named Pierre Michaud, and he's living in France. He's a blacksmith for the carriage trade in the 1850s and 1860s. In 1868, he makes a partnership with a company called Oliver Brothers. And he and Oliver Brothers and their partnership, they make the first mass-produced true bicycle. And at this time, it's still called a velocipede. So it has a serpentine frame. It kind of curves a bit. It's not the frame that we will see later in this presentation, but this bicycle has pedals, a pedal system, so you can pedal it. It doesn't have the chain drive yet, and it has these spoon brakes. So a little bit more control, both in how, if you can brake or if you have to keep going or use your feet. Like the original Velocipede, the only brake was your feet. So there were a lot of worn out soles of shoes at that time, I would imagine. This new Michaud Velocipede had those brakes. Those pedals, you can also you don't have to sort of push yourself across like down the road with your feet any longer. You can use those pedals. Now, the frame of the Michaud Velocipede is made of wrought iron and it's bolted together with heavy bolts, and the wheels themselves are made. Again, he's a carriage maker, like carriage wheels, so wooden with metal bands around. And it was incredibly uncomfortable to ride. There is no suspension system. Like steel is pretty unforgiving. So as you're driving around, you're feeling every single pebble beneath those tires, or those wheels, I should say. And this gave it an unpleasant nickname called the Bone Shaker. And it is not very comfortable at all. Now, and as Oliver Brothers and Pierre are working together, they are noticing Oliver Brothers is noticing other people with improved frames and improved designs for these velocipedes. And Oliver Brothers is really encouraging Pierre to adapt his model, but he refuses for some reason. And so they break partnership, and his Pierre's son Ernest Michaud actually invents the diagonal frame, which we can see in that bottom right hand image, with Pierre himself and his velocipede. So Pierre is a little bit more open to adapting that model, and the diagonal frame it turns out to be stronger than the serpentine frame, and many bicycles have adaptations of this diagonal frame after Ernest's adaptation, so to speak. So then we move into the later in the century. There's Eugene Mayer, another French inventor, and Eugene is known as the father of the high bicycle, or what we'll later call the big wheel. So when people are riding this bone crusher with the wheels of two equal size, they are noticing that, again, it's so uncomfortable and so bumpy to ride. And Eugene realizes if you make the front wheel bigger than the back wheel, you can not only go faster because suddenly you're turning a huge wheel. So it's going, one revolution is going to help you travel forward much farther than a smaller circumference wheel. It's also going to take some of the shock away when you're driving. So it's a bit of a smoother ride, but as we'll see, there are some drawbacks to a big wheel. So Eugene Mayer, in addition to changing this design, he also patents the wire spoke tension wheel for bicycles. Much decades earlier in the century, there was another inventor who invented the wire spoke wheel by the name of George Cayley, but he doesn't invent it for velocipedes at that time. So Eugene Mayer adapts Cayley's patent into the wire tension wheel for bicycles. So no longer is the wheel built like a carriage wheel, like Michaux's Bone Crusher was. And by 1869, Eugene Mayer debuts what he calls the big wheel. Now, um, an Englishman by the name of James Starley, he is also an inventor and a bicycle designer, and he adapts that wire tension wheel a little bit further to create the tangent spoke wheel in 1878. And he introduces a mechanism to drive the wheels together using the chain system. And he also creates the differential gears so you can change, uh, whether you're going up or downhill, how hard you have to pedal essentially to go uphill or downhill with the big wheel. Now, William Hillman, yet another inventor and manufacturer. Later, he's an automobile manufacturer. Throwing his hat in the wheel into the ring, he mass produces the big wheel in England, France, and now America. And now America is sort of getting it another taste of the big wheel. Again, James Starley and William Hillman, because the big wheel goes under so many design adaptations in England, it starts to get an English nickname called the penny farthing. So if we look at this penny and this farthing next to one another, that matches the profile of a big wheel, where the front wheel is much, much bigger than the back wheel. Now, big wheels, if anyone has seen a big wheel in a museum or in a movie, you might think, how do I can see some questions I have about riding this bike. So namely, how do you get up on the bike? So it's not like you can throw your leg over. The seat is very, very high, usually at like shoulder or chest height for a grown man. So you have to sort of prop up the bike next to like a wall or a stool, get up on the stool, and then throw your leg over and sort of push yourself off and quickly pedal so you don't fall over. So there's difficulty getting up on a big wheel and certainly difficulty getting off of a big wheel. You can't stop on a big wheel and sort of put your legs down to hold yourself steady because you're too far and too high off the ground. So you have to stop next to something and hold yourself up and brace yourself. Big wheels at this time are also prohibitively costly. So most of the people who have access and to whom big wheels are accessible are people that are moneyed, who and essentially have the idle time to partake in pleasure cruising on big wheels. And what happens is there are young men from elite families who create big wheel bike gangs. And if you thought the velocipede was a menace, the big wheel is even more of a menace. And these riders knew it was a menace. And they could surround you on the street or, give you a real scare. And people just did not like being around big wheels at this time. They were known as, like a young man's sort of almost like a daredevil vehicle. Funnily enough, if anyone has read or seen the old adaptation of Little Lord Fauntleroy. He has a big wheel, and of course, he's a very privileged young boy, very gentle, very kind young boy, but privileged all the same, and that he has access to that big wheel at that time. So because there's this sort of like adventurous side to big wheeling, it really lends itself to racing and sort of competitive big wheeling, essentially. Now, I mentioned earlier in the presentation this idea of the safety bicycle. So we'll see when the safety bicycle is introduced just a few years after the big wheel starts being called the ordinary bicycle, and this new safety bicycle, this new two-wheeled almost the same size wheel bicycle, the bicycle we have today, is known as the safety bicycle. And because of its appeal, which again we'll go into, it very quickly displaces the big wheel. And the big wheel becomes sort of relegated to like athletic sports teams. So all over Rochester, and really all over the United States, but particularly in Rochester, we really love our big wheels, and we form big wheel clubs and societies. So for instance, there is the bicycle club in Rochester. It starts with 11 people. By the end of the summer, it doubles in size. And we can see 13 individuals here in this photo with their big wheels. And you can see some of the gentlemen that are seated on top of their big wheels are steadying themselves next to the other gentlemen, because again, you can't really um, stay up on the bike, the big wheel, while it's stationary. You would have to hold on to something, or if you're riding like a one wheel, like we see on the right, you probably have to move it back and forth just to stay upright, like a unicycle. Now there are local celebrities in Rochester that make a name for themselves and really a living in a retirement from big wheel riding. And one of them is a gentleman named Nick Kaufman, who we see on this one wheel on the right. As a little boy, one of his friends in the neighborhood buys a big wheel and breaks their arm, and they're kind of like traumatized by this. And Nick really wants this big wheel. He doesn't have the money for it because again they're rather expensive. So he uses all the money he has. He asks a loan from his mom and dad, a loan from both of his brothers, and he uses that money all together to buy the big wheel. He pays off his parents and relatives, and he becomes a celebrity with his just the big wheel riding skill he has. And we can see here one of his publicity photos with a fake background in the back. Now, it wasn't just men who became celebrities for their big wheeling. It was also women. So we have Carolyn Wilhelmina Kiner, or Carrie, and her stage name was Elsa von Blumen. And she's a competitive big wheel racer, or a penny farthing racer. And she races mostly other men and horses and beats them very consistently. And she is riding for charity cases most usually, and we have both an image of her on the left and then a cartoon of her beating a man driven horse at the with at the in this race here in the Rochester Driving Park. And she, as indicated here on this slide, she would bring in crowds of up to sometimes like 3,000 people just to see her ride. Now, you can look at what she's wearing in this photograph, and she has on stockings, little boots, breeches, and then sort of this short overskirt with tassels in this very tailored jacket. So it's very masculine in that regard. It's a bifurcated garment. It's a tailored garment. Tailoring has a history with men's clothing. But people don't really bat an eye that she's wearing this. And it's because it's a performative she's a performer, and this costume is a theatrical performative costume. She's not going about her everyday life riding her big wheel in this ensemble down the street for a Sunday big wheel ride. She's not walking down the street in this ensemble, or else people would be quite scandalized. She's only wearing it when she's on stage, or in this case, when she's on wheel. And so that's acceptable at that time. But we're going to look at the introduction of the safety bicycle and clothing pieces that people were not so okay with. So with the invention of the safety bicycle, there are some new adaptations that make it far superior to the big wheel. So first of all, it has rubber tires, pneumatic tires. So now they're it's a rubber tube. It's a tube filled with air. So how is that an improvement from a solid rubber tube? So with solid rubber, it sure is better than a wheel made of wood with a steel band around it, but a solid rubber tire, you're still kind of bouncing pretty hard on every pebble. There's a little bit of give in solid rubber, but it's not as much give as like an actual air-filled tire that is literally cushioning you as you roll over those bumps. Now, Thomas Goodyear has created by the 1880s, like vulcanized rubber. But when you have solid rubber, it's still going to crack in really cold environments and get sticky in hot environments. So, not the best when you're traveling over dust outside, where it could be hot or cold, depending on what in which climb you're riding your bike or your safety bicycle. The pneumatic tires don't crack or get as sticky as solid rubber. And again, because they're filled with air, the cushioning it makes it so much more comfortable when you're driving now, or riding rather. Now, in a big wheel, we can see in this illustration down in the bottom left, see how high that seat is? It's not on the back wheel, it's right on top of that big wheel, and your hands are the handlebar is way down by the seat as well. So with the lower seat set back, you can get on the bike more easily. You can dismount the bike more easily. If you fall off the bike, you have a shorter distance to travel while you're falling, and therefore the impact will be less severe than if you fell off a big wheel, something they would often call headers, because you'd fall forward and hit your head on the ground, falling off a big wheel. It also means, again, that you have the handlebars more level with where you want them to be. So you're not lurched forward. You certainly have more control. You have a more comfortable ride, a safer ride, a more controlled ride, a steadier ride. So this safety bicycle, you can see why they call it safety. It's a lot safer than the big wheel. It appeals to a lot of people, the young, the old, the male and the female, because it has undergone so many adaptations in technology and has been perfected. It's also cheaper than the big wheel, so it's much more accessible. The front wheel is smaller; they're almost an equal size. The front wheel is a tiny bit bigger than the back wheel, and it's again, it incorporates again that chain driven gear ratio. Now, in 1888, John Dunlop, who is a familiar name to all of us, he perfects that pneumatic tire, and it's perfect for these new, smooth, paved roads. So the ride, sort of all these technologies, and infrastructure and the bike design itself, they all sort of congeal and they create this perfect environment for the 1890s, when bicycle mania takes hold of all of us, especially individuals living here in Rochester. Now, the frame undergoes yet another redesign that perfects it, and we still use this diamond frame today, and that's from a gentleman named Isaac R. Johnson. And he is the first African American to patent a design for a bike frame in America. There are many patents for bike frames before Isaac R. Johnson, but he is the first individual to patent the diamond frame, and he's the first African American to patent a bike frame point blank period. And that again is the same frame that we are using today in most modern pleasure bicycles. Now there's an individual named Albert Pope who produces bicycles in the late 1880s, the safety bicycle, and into the 1890s when his company explodes. A little old biking company called Columbia Manufacturing, who I'm sure we're all quite familiar with. And in the John L. Wehle Gallery, part of our Becoming Gendered exhibit, right in the front lobby, we have a Columbia bicycle on loan to us from the Ontario County Historical Society with a female lady biker mounted on top, which brings us to our next topic. So, bicycle mania. So, in the late 1880s and definitely into the 1890s, really the world and especially Rochester, New York, is overtaken by what is now called, and actually was called at that time, biking or bicycle mania. So the safety bicycle is out. It appeals to most people, men and women, young and old. It's accessible. It's safe to ride. These new paved roads are making it available and comfortable to ride. And people just want to get out and they want to ride. And a lot of individuals, a lot of physicians, a lot of manufacturers are asserting that this new recreation it's sort of like it's like a sport, it's like a physical activity that's just physical enough to be athletic, but not so physical that you're going to perspire or that you need to be especially strong or sports oriented to get into it in the first place. So in the 1890s, first in 1889, only 700 bicycles are sold in Rochester in 1889. Now, if we go just 8 years later into 1897, 40,000 bicycles are sold a year in Rochester. So you can see just within those 8 years how much bicycle mania has taken hold of the world and of Rochester. And suppliers of bicycles as businesses explode in the city. In the 1880s, there were only two. By 1897, there are 25 local suppliers and manufacturers of bicycles, just pumping them out and dispersing them. And those are just the manufacturers. Like there are also department stores that will buy them from Columbia and sell them within their stores. So bicyclists at this time, because there's such an influx of different people riding bicycles, there are two sort of waves of thinking that go in the 1890s. So one is from the point of view of the bicyclists, and they are demanding better paved roads. Because again, even with these new pneumatic tires, if it's a very bumpy road, you can feel every bump that you're going over, or you have to maneuver around it. And they're trying to maneuver around carriages and carriage drivers and horses and maneuvering through these bumps. So they're demanding better roads and sort of like almost like their own little strip of the road, like bicyclists have today. Meanwhile, pedestrians and carriage drivers become increasingly anti-cyclist. They call these people scorchers. They particularly have a distaste for people that are coasting on their bicycles. So you pick up speed and then you're kind of going downhill. You don't have to pedal anymore. You're just relaxing, enjoying the wind and coasting down, and you zoom past someone and there are so many newspaper articles, illustrations just deriding these people. They really let them have it in the newspaper. These terrible coasters and cruisers who are just driving past me so quickly they could have knocked me over. And some of it is quite hyperbolic. So there's like sort of the contention that's first started in 1819 with the velocipede reaches a crescendo in 1892, and by 1893 the Rochester Council is like, okay, we're gonna try to like limit the speed of these people, and they impose the first speed limit in Rochester, and it was not on carriages, it was on bicyclists, and the speed limit was 6 miles per hour, which could feel pretty fast on a bike. But nowadays, like the general cruising speed of a bike is anywhere from 5 to 15 miles per hour. So 6 miles per hour is actually on like the slower end of bicycle riding. That does not solve the problem with bicyclists seemingly like zooming in and out and around people. This is a time before uh, automobiles. So unless a policeman was also on a bike, which there were biked policemen, it would be kind of hard to, someone zooms past you and you say, hey, you're going faster than 6 miles per hour. Unless you're also on a bike, you're not going to catch up with that person. So by 1896, the Rochester Common Council makes a new ordinance and it prohibits bicyclists from riding on the sidewalks. So instead of riding now in the road right with the carriages, which some people were doing, um, the cyclist said, you know what, we're going to try to solve this problem ourselves. We're going to remove ourselves out of the city, and all the cyclists in the city, if we all give $1 in a tax, we can fund the construction of side paths, or what we would call bicycling paths. And this is actually a huge success. And they make hundreds of miles that connect Rochester with all its suburbs. So, like from Rochester all the way to like Hamlin, from Rochester all the way to Macedon, Rochester to Irondequoit, Henrietta, Avon, and people are riding their bicycle all over the place. I mean, think of it. You don't have to hitch up your horse. You don't have to own a horse. You don't need to know how to drive a carriage. You can just get a bike and travel tens of miles all by yourself in one day, powered by your legs and your ambition. Like this was like suddenly being connected to the internet where you could just travel and go all sorts of places all in one afternoon. So people loved these side paths. They used them in every day. They had Side Paths magazine, which was published on a quarterly basis. And by 1900, Rochester was known the world over as the best place to ride a bike. And they were named the best place to ride a bike and the best side paths in the country in 1900. So then we come to the lady bicyclist question. So a lot of the sexist and misogynist attitude toward women entering into athletic recreation or previously male-dominated arenas, that carries over to women cyclists. And a lot of the negative attitude about women, like, quote, not knowing how to drive a bike, carries over into automobile misogyny as well, which continues to this day. So if you think, again, I mentioned how bicycling uh, changes your agency and your ability to go all sorts of places with one afternoon. For women, this is particularly freeing. And Susan B. Anthony herself, as this quote on screen states, says that bicycling has done more to emancipate women than anything else in the world. It gives women a feeling of freedom and self-reliance, the picture of free, untrammeled womanhood. Now, if we look at this first picture on the left, we can see women on bicycles in the late 1880s, early, I'd say 88, 89. And they're in skirts. Now, there is a chain drive on bicycles, as we all know at this time, and your skirt can get, at the very least, gunked up and stained with the grease. At the worst, it can get caught up in the gear, and then you're kind of stuck on the bike. It might tear. You might have an embarrassing exposure that you don't want. Your upper shin could have been exposed. So some women start to adapt their costume and their underwear for bicycling. And this is when we see women start to wear a tailored knickerbocker suit, really taking elements of the 1840s and 50s bloomer ensemble, which peaked and then fizzled out itself because it was so derided. And women are starting to wear this costume. Some women opt to wear this costume while bicycling. There's also all of this new underwear that's coming about in the late 70s, the 80s, and the 90s for women who are entering recreation and sports and athletics en masse. And these undergarments, particularly corsets, or as they sometimes call them, health waists, it's still a corset, it just has a different name marketed that way. Um, and these health waists or these health corsets are using different materials other than baleen or really spring steel at this time to create that fashionable silhouette to give the body and the bust support, but also a freedom of movement. So a lot of them have straps, which fashion corsets at that time often lacked straps. So you could adjust the straps, you can adjust the lacing on the sides. Some people might mistake this pink Ferris Health corset on the right as a pregnancy corset because of the lacing on the side. It's a little misleading, but it's actually an equestrian or bike riding corset. So when you're seated, you can before being seated, you can loosen the ties on the side, so it can move up a bit on your lower abdomen as you sit down and be more comfortable in a seated position. So women are changing their fashions, changing their clothing from underwear to outerwear because they want to participate in this sport. And there are marketers out there who are more than happy to make that product for you to buy and participate in that sport. And many people are finding this fashion very shocking. So if we look on the left, we have two images of mid 1890s women in fashionable women's dress. So wide, almost trapezoidal skirts that are the hem at the bottom is heavily stiffened, often with buckram or like horsehair strips and velvet strips to hold that skirt out, very wide, often very heavily plumed hats. And then the women on the right who are wearing in what they would have seen as a decidedly masculine costume for this pastime, where it's a bifurcated garment. They're practically wearing pants, even though the jackets have these enormous sleeves that are very fashionable for women in the mid 1890s. Many people are finding it masculine and too masculine to abide. And there is a lot of negative discourse that takes place in the 1890s where women in these bicycling ensembles are seen as masculine and threatening the position of men in society. So this is where a lot of that same language we hear today about people and gender variance in their clothing, we hear it first in the, not first, but we hear it in the 1890s, and it's almost word for word today, where they are saying, this is going to upend the bedrock of society, which is the family unit. You are disturbing these natural and innate roles that men and women are born into and should not deviate from. Women are going to be out riding their bicycles, smoking cigarettes, and men are going to be at home taking care of their children. And there are a lot of negative advertisements at this time where men, it's called the suffragette Madonna. So women wearing these bicycle pants and these bicycle suits not only are dressing like men and spending their time outside, but they want the right to vote too. And there's these images of these men called suffragette Madonnas, where the man has a halo and he's holding the baby, and there are dishes piling up, and their terrible wives are smoking and laughing out in public in the street. What men should be doing. And what's going to happen if children see this? They're going to look at these women buzzing by in their knickerbockers, and they're going to be confused, and they're not going to know who's a male and who's a female. And this anxiety about gender uh, at today, it has lived on into today, with a lot of discourse and anxiety, legislation, and sometimes even violence, unfortunately, as a reaction to perceived gender violations. How is this going to affect the future of humanity? And that backlash is pretty severe. So severe that physicians make up a disease called bicycle face. That the sheer unconscious effort to maintain one's balance tends to produce a wearied and exhausted bicycle face. So, this was apparently a disease that women bicyclists all got, where the amount of effort it takes to ride a bike is going to give you this wrinkled, worn out, flat and wide, angry, masculine face. And it's unnatural to women. So a lot of the advertisements that go against women and as bicyclists portray them as male. So there's a little boy here mistaking this woman as a man and trying to sell her matches for her cigarettes, because not only is she a biker, but she's a smoker too. And the profile of this woman, she's purposely drawn to look like a man, an angry man at that, because she's just that bike is just too hard for women's innate gentility and fineness of anatomy to handle. And then, of course, we have women bicyclists, this funny kind of frumpy, masculine, old maid. If you are a bicyclist woman, you're gonna be undesirable and end up an old maid and unmarried at this time. So some women, they still wanted to ride the bike. The appeal, some would say that like the appeal, the agency of bicycling, the mania around it, and some of the ridicule made it all the more appealing for some women. But some women, were like, I just want to ride this darn bike, and I don't want to upend the world and the future of my family, and I don't want to embarrass my husband, perhaps, or I just don't want to deal with all the nonsense. But I still want to ride that bike. So they adapt clothing such as the divided skirt. So when you're standing up, it looks like you're wearing a skirt. And sometimes it even has a panel of buttons down one leg, and you can unbutton that panel, turn it, and button it down the other side and make a skirt, almost like skirts, a skirt short, but a full length skirt at this time. And when you're going to bicycle, you'll unbutton it and re-separate the legs, and then you can sit astride the bicycle. So this would allow women to participate in that sport, but still avoid some of that vitriol that was being lampooned at women bicyclists, excuse me, who wore the knickerbockers at that time. And the smart, classy appeal of divided skirts lives on today, as we see in this modern 21st century woman wearing a divided bicycle skirt. They're often made out of like cotton canvas or cotton twill. We have one in a study drawer on view from Rochester Museum and Science Center, in the study drawer of Becoming Gendered, which again will extend throughout the summer of 2024. So, with that, I'd like to say thank you to everyone for tuning in tonight, to get some history of the bicycle, and really bicycle mania in the 1890s in Rochester. And I will say a lot of those bicycle side paths still exist. Many of the paths along the canal are previous side paths and are still used by bicyclists and cyclists to this day. So, thank you so much for having me, Ben.
Thank you so much. I do have a couple questions if you got a couple minutes.
Absolutely.
So, actually, our first question in the chat is actually about the side paths and bike lanes. You say some of them at least still exist alongside the
Mhm.
canal.
Yeah.
Where did the rest of them go? Do you know anything about what happened to them?
So I would presume that as the city expands, as suburbia expands, and as the first automobile comes to Rochester, I believe in 1901.
Hmm.
So there's actually a severe dip in bicycle use after the turn of the century. So some of the paths get eaten up with the development and the widening and the expanding of roadways for for cars, essentially, for automobiles and carriages. A lot of them get swallowed up in the establishment of highways and the highway system in the mid 20th century and expanding suburbia itself. Especially, it's really that automobile where people are like, you know what, I can drive from Hamlin to Rochester in an hour instead of 3 hours on the bicycle. So let's get rid of the side path. Let's expand a road for the automobile.
Yeah.
And slowly but surely, we start to lose our side paths.
Makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense. Um, awesome. Another question. When did bicycle baskets become popular?
Oh, great question.
Yeah.
I'll be honest with you, I wouldn't quite know when that as a style emerges. Some of them, some photos from the late 80s and early 1890s, I see them on bicycles. I will say they tend to be in the back for a lot of utilitarian bike riders. So like think of like a mail delivery person or milk delivery person. Whereas when they're in the front and they're sort of like a wicker basket, those tend to be for like pleasure cruising, and they're made for men and women, but women tended to have them more often than men did.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Cool. Well, I don't have any more questions from the chat right now.
Okay.
But thank you so much, Brandon. This was a great talk once again.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here. So thank you so
Oh, of
much.
course, of course. And thank you, everybody who tuned in. And like I said, make sure to check out the next talk, which should be in early February. But with that, we will say good night.
Happy biking.
Happy biking.